In this next part, I'm going to talk about doing cross-cultural ministry and how that relates to common worldviews. And to do that, I'm going to introduce some concepts that really borrow from the field of philosophy. Some of this comes from American philosopher Ken Wilber, but also it borrows from Plato and some others. Two of the dimensions that we talked about, these are Hofstede's dimensions, but also they've been used a lot on worldviews. The individual versus the collective. And how much do you focus on an individual perspective versus the collective perspective? And, a lot of people know Eastern cultures are more collective focus versus Western cultures. And then you have the internal perspective. So how does something feel to you versus maybe the science behind it, the external perspective of what's the science that's causing it to feel that way to you. So if you take these two dimensions or two axes, then you come up with four worldviews that you can have. So number one is the exterior individual worldview, and that's where you view things as an it or a body, or really that's kind of the worldview of science. The interior individual worldview, and that's the I, the mind, that's how you're experiencing things. The interior collective worldview, and that's we or culture. And the exterior collective, and that's they or society. Now, why this is important is these worldviews are one of the main ways that we get separated cross-culturally. So, Paul said that we see through a glass darkly, so it's clouded. And, the glass is different colors for different people. And most people, the reality is that they can only see one part of one quadrant of those four quadrants that I was showing you on worldview. And each person's personality and culture is going to predispose their lens on the world. And the reality is that we need multiple lenses to serve effectively. So let me explain some of the ways that we can get predisposed. So taking that grid before, what are the ways that we might get predisposed to the individual worldview? If you're detail-oriented, so that personality types, Myers-Briggs S, you're going to probably focus a little bit more on, you hear the forest versus the trees. You're going to focus more on the trees, the individuals. Protestant, and, the contrast, Protestant versus Catholic. So Protestants more individual, Catholics more collective. Western culture versus Eastern culture. And then conservative versus liberal. So if you have all four of things of those towards the individual, you're probably going to have a worldview that's more individualistic. Then in the other domain, you have external versus internal. So external is really the thinkers versus the feelers. Western culture again versus Eastern culture is Western culture is more external, Eastern is more internal. And secular. So the secular world, science, you're looking at the external experience, whereas religious, if your religious experience is entirely about God, but you've never had a relationship with God or never had any sort of experience, then you're missing a significant part of religion. So why is this important? So one is just recognizing what worldview people are coming from in these quadrants, but the other is to recognize the power of pulling together these quadrants. So let's take a problem that many ministries might try to address or organizations might try to address. So understanding addiction, and I use the word understanding, I put knowledge in parentheses next to it because this is a cognitive approach. You could also take an effective approach or a doing approach, but this is trying to understand addiction. So the first quadrant, the exterior individual, you might look at the biochemistry of addiction, medical treatments, hereditary predisposition, easy access to drugs, lack of physical care of their bodies, and the biophysical, emotional predisposition. So their genetics might, predispose them to that. So science has a lot to say about that. Then the interior individual, so whenever people are unemployed, often they get bored. And if you look at the high places of addiction, often it's high unemployment. People lacking emotional intelligence, personal isolation, broken relationships, spiritual emptiness, wounds of abuse. People can use drugs to cover up and separation from God. So churches are very good and Christian counseling is very good at addressing a lot of those issues. But then you have this collective. So, we have this cultural devaluation of emotion. You have subcultures where addiction's the norm. I grew up and I worked at a Burger King where everyone was doing drugs. And you have it promoted in the mass media. You might have groups that are trying to self-medicate because of cultural oppression. And then you might have, worship of sex and hedonism that might encourage addiction. And in some cases, you might have cultural inheritance from past oppression, where groups that have been oppressed over decades or centuries often will have stronger rates of addiction, largely from that past. So then the exterior collective is you have breakdown of the family, you have lack of jobs, systemic oppression, political priorities, the economics of drug trade. So if you're going to take an approach to addiction, really what you need is a 4-quadrant approach. So if you're trying to teach and you're trying to address an addict in your ministry, you need to address all of these things. So so that's one of the main points. Now, with that, I also want to talk about some of the big cultural clusters of religious worldviews. So there's something called the Wesleyan triangle, or quadrilateral, not triangle, quadrilateral. And what the idea behind this is there's really 4 ways that you can know God, a combination of scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. And depending on what religious tradition you come from, you're going to emphasize one over the other, typically. So everyone's going to have to do some combination of all 4 of these, but how much do you weight each one is going to vary. So evangelicals value scripture is dominant, whereas Catholics will value tradition much more than others. So charismatics are going to value experience much more, and reason, liberal mainline denominations are going to value reason. Now, part of what's important about this is each group's going to have its own cultural strength, and it's going to have some cultural risk, depending on that. So the cultural strength of evangelicals is there's tons of innovative ethnic churches that are out there. And I throw white churches, white Western churches, that I consider most of them an ethnic church. So, and then the cultural risk, though, of evangelicals is that there's a lot of individualism and there's a lot of division that, the Protestant churches especially, will keep dividing. So Catholics, their cultural strength is that they have traditional ethnic churches. So often if you go in Latin America, it's a big part of the local cultural. But then you also have a risk of cultural Catholics, where they're more culturally Catholic, but they don't have they don't really believe the faith or have much personal relationship. Then charismatics, the cultural strength is, if you look at the rise of churches in the majority world, those that are growing the most are generally charismatics, because they're growing most in the lower class dominant communities. So they do really well in the lower class dominant churches, but the cultural risk is that you can have too much chaos. And then reason, or the liberal mainline, often they're the strongest on gender issues. So they are, I talked about most churches are going to be either focused on race, class, or gender if they're trying to address these issues. And most of the liberal mainline churches are focused on gender. Their cultural risk is secularization and class bias. So hopefully that's helpful, just to explain how culture relates to these bigger picture worldviews. And with that, you can hopefully apply this in your lessons this week. So thanks a lot.